Before we start working on any specific scenes, I first want to show you all the different ways we can create water effects and ocean type water, because there's a couple of different ways we can do it, depending on the type of scene we want and the overall quality of that scene. And we can use infinite planes, regular planes, cylinders, and also procedural terrains in order to create different oceans, and also using atmospheric effects, which we'll get into once we start working on the different types of scenes. So the first thing I want to show you is working with the procedural terrain and the open ocean. Now right now, I've just loaded in a procedural terrain, and we have all of our default surfaces and size for this. So let's go ahead and modify this terrain in order to make it work as an ocean. So I'm going to right mouse click and go to Edit Object. You can also double click on that object to open up the terrain editor. I want to make sure I turn off zero edges, and that's going to give us the full procedural without cutting off the edges and giving us that mountainous effect. I'm going to right mouse click, making sure we're in the procedural tab, and go to Edit Function. And now you can see we have a simple fractal, which I want to change to open ocean. Now we can see this is connected directly to time, and that way we have an animated surface. And this is going to be the best way to create any sort of ocean or water effect. Now we have a lot of options for controlling our ocean, and we can see under waves we have choppiness and gain and wind. We can control the density and the intensity of our wind effect. We also have a largest feature, smallest feature, which is something that's available for all fractal nodes. Well, what I want to do is first change our wavelength, because if we take a look right now, if I close this out, we can see that our ocean will be extremely large, and we're not going to see a lot of waves or the kind of detail we need in order to create a decent size water effect and a good size volume of water. So I'm going to go back into the function editor, select our node, and we're going to change our wavelength down to 0.05 on both the X, Y, and the Z, and I'm going to click OK. Now we can see much smaller waves, but of course their height is a little bit too high. So what I want to do is turn on force extension. And now the main reason and technique behind using the force extension as opposed to just squishing our procedural terrain once we're out of the editor and in the main interface is because we want our volume that's underneath our waves in case we want to go under that water. So what I want to do is take our force extension and turn it all the way up to 10. And now we have a good volume of water underneath our main waves. And also make sure that you have skin only off, depending on which settings you had set before. There's a possibility that could have been on. And if you use skin only, then it will remove that volume underneath, which is extremely helpful for creating underwater scenes and adjusting just the overall look of your water. Now if we take a look, we can see our waves are still a little too large because we want to be using this terrain and make it a lot larger in order to get a really good looking effect. So at this point, what I can start doing is just adjusting our scale directly within the terrain editor and not going into the function editor. So I'm going to change our scale to 0.1. And now what we can see is we have a lot of depth from our waves. So we need to make a few adjustments back in the function editor. And under our wave section, we can see that we have gain. And now this gain function is going to adjust the overall height and basically the depth of our waves. So I'm going to bring our gain down to 0.1 and click OK. And now we can see that has leveled out quite a bit, but it's very pixelated at this point, so I'm going to go up to the top and click ×2. Now this doesn't adjust the actual quality of our terrain in the render, just basically the preview of it within the terrain editor. And also the underlying image that we use if we want to blend together any of our painting effects. So I'm going to turn that up to 1024 by 1024. And we can still see we have a little bit too much height. So I'll go back to Edit Function, go to our gain, and type in 0.03. And click OK. And now we can see that it has leveled out a lot more, and that might be good enough to work with our scene. So I can click OK. And now we can see our terrain, where it's nice and flat on the top, but what we need to do is scale this up. And I'm using an object size for our overall function, and not a global world size. So as we increase this, our material is going to increase with it. And since we already kind of took a look at the waves, it'll be a lot easier to adjust that. So I'm going to switch to our scaling gizmo and just size that up. And now what we can also do is go up to our ruler tab, go to the middle icon, which is going to be size, and we can see that we have 172 meters by 172. I'm going to go ahead and increase that to 250 by 250, and keep our Z at 30 for right now. And now we can take a look at our terrain. And in the preview you can sort of see the overall outlines of that bump, but we still have that default surface, which doesn't look very good. So what we want to do is change that out to a water surface, and just use one of the presets to begin with, and then modify it in order to fit our terrain. So I'm going to select our procedural terrain, and we can see we have a very low quality preview right now. And if I go to File and Options, and we take a look under our display options, you can see I have our instant draw turned down a little low. So I'm going to go ahead and increase that to almost better, which would be almost the best setting. Click OK, and now we can see the water a lot better, a lot more detail. And we could also turn that up all the way if you want to see the full amount of detail. And now we can see that even better. And as we move closer to our terrain, we can see that updating. And this really is something you don't want to try if you're using a little bit of a lower end system or video cards that can't handle it. And technically in this case you really don't need the quality to be this high, because the overall waves don't have a whole lot of detail to them. So I'm going to turn that down to about halfway, or I'd say about 60%. And now we can still see all the definition we need, but we don't have to worry about using too many system resources in order to display. Let's select our procedural terrain once again, and now I'm going to go up and make sure we're in the first tab, and we can load in a material for this. I want to go to our liquids, and I'm just going to use our default water. Now we could technically start with any of the different waters available, or any transparent surface really, but I want to start with just the default water. There's not a whole lot to it. It'll be very easy to modify and edit in order to get the sort of effect that we need. But there are a few things I'm going to do within the material editor just to modify this, because we have a lot of our detail within our terrain, and mainly that's for our bump. So we're going to go to the bump option, and what I just want to do is right mouse click and reset it, and click OK. Because all of our definition is being controlled by our procedural terrain, and we don't need those extra bumps that are part of that material in order to make this look like water, because it already will. You can always add a little bit of extra definition to it if you want, but we're just going to stick with clearing out that bump map and just using the definition from our terrain itself. So let's do a quick render. I'm just going to right mouse click on our camera to bring up our render options. I'm going to render this at broadcast, render to screen to make sure that we're opening a new window and not rendering it directly in the view, and that way we can choose our resolution as well. And I'm just going to select 640 by 480, which will give us a really good idea of what it is we're looking at. And all the rest of the settings we can basically leave at the default, and then I can go ahead and render this out, and we can take a look and see how it looks. Now I also have our natural film response turned on, to give us a little bit of a better look. And I'm just going to leave all of our other post-render options pretty much at default, which is turned off. If we take a look at our terrain right now, in the render of our water, we can see it doesn't quite look right, but mainly that's because of the height we are from our water. And as we start moving down closer to it, it's going to look a little bit better. And we might need to adjust that gain value as well, because we have some very high peaks within that water. So I'm going to bring down our camera closer to our terrain, and we can render out another frame. And now we can see the depth a little bit better. And of course, I do want to adjust our sun just a little bit in its overall position, because right now it's very low in the sky, because I'm using just our default sky. And we just want to make a few adjustments. And what I also want to do is move our terrain up a little bit higher. If I go ahead and double click on the top of that main camera view, and we just want to see where our terrain is at and how much higher it is than our ground plane, because of course it is transparent, so we do want to be able to see underneath it, but right now I mainly want to focus on the overall shape, so we don't want any interference with our ground plane. And it looks like it's at a good level, where we should have enough murkiness in the water to cover up our overall ground plane. If we want to increase that value, I can double click on our surface, go to transparency, and then under fading out, increase that a little more towards murky. And now we can see that darken up a lot more, which means before we were definitely seeing our ground plane underneath, which right now is a completely plain solid surface. But of course that color will interfere with the overall look we have. So I'm going to go to the atmosphere editor, and under light, I first want to adjust this just a little more towards sunlight, and we'll see some harsher shadows that way. And then under the sun tab, I'm going to decrease our pitch just to raise it up into the sky. And of course, once we get to 90, then we're going to have an angle that our sun is directly in the top of the sky. And as we start bringing that down, it'll start to set, or depending which time of day it is, it might be rising. So I'm going to click OK. And now we have a little bit of a brighter sky. And I'm going to move down closer to our terrain, angle our camera up a little bit, and I also want to modify the aspect so that we're not working with this 4:3 ratio. I'm going to set this to 16:9, which of course always looks better. I'll go ahead and render that out. And now we can take a look at that render, and we can see all the nice height areas that we have, and it looks really good overall. Of course, the one thing we do have to keep in mind is that because this is a procedural terrain and has a limited size, that we will not be able to extend the horizon. That can present a lot of different problems. Mainly the problem, if we move up higher into the sky with our camera, we can see in the preview and also in the main camera view where our terrain extends. And basically that's all that's going to render, and the rest of that we're not going to see at all. So with the procedural terrain, in this case, you would normally want to use this effect very close to the water, and that way we would have our bumps and our waves moving up over the area. And I'm just going to rotate around our camera a little. And we can see that we might need to bring down that gain a little. So I'm going to select our procedural terrain, double click on it, go to the function editor for it, select the open ocean, and our gain is currently set to 0.03. Well, I'm going to set this to 0.01 and click OK. And you can see we're using extremely low values here because we are editing this at such a large value. but now we can see much smoother looking waves. And really, depending on how rough you want the ocean to be, you can just adjust that gain value and get a lot of different types of effects. I'm going to go back to the atmosphere editor and just decrease the pitch a little to lower our sun, and we'll take a look at another render. I'm going to click OK to close out our post-render options, and now we can see we have much smaller heightened waves, and it does look a little bit better. And this will create a really nice effect. And of course it's completely animated because it is connected directly to time. I'm going to close that out, and now we're going to take a look at another one of the advantages of using the procedural terrain. And what I want to do is move our camera down into the procedural terrain, and that way we're going to be under our water. And there's a lot of different ways to achieve this effect, and we're going to be looking at a couple of different options for that, and really what's going to work best, and of course what the disadvantages are, depending on which sort of shape you're using and the overall size. And now that we're under the water, let's take a look at another drawback to this method. So I'll go ahead and render out this frame, and we can take a look. Now, because, once again, this isn't something that is infinite, we can see the extent of the overall water effect, and of course that limit based on that size. And even though we have a murkiness level which would block out our objects, we can still see the atmosphere through it. And of course, because this is a rectangular shape, we can also see where that corner is and the overall edges, which doesn't give us a very good underwater effect. And one thing we can do to limit that is if we go to the atmosphere editor, we want to make sure that whenever we're doing any sort of underwater shot, that we turn off the aerial perspective. And now we can see most of that has disappeared in our preview. We can go ahead and render that out again. And it definitely looks a lot better. But whether or not you can tell, you can still see the box for our terrain. So that's not something that's really going to be practical if you want to look into the distance underwater. So these procedural terrains can really kind of limit you based on overall scale of your scene and how far you're going to see. But a really nice advantage is if we move our camera up to face the sky. And what I also want to do is give us a little more of a wide angle shot. So I'm going to use just that zoom function and go ahead and render out another frame. And now we can see from underneath the water, the sun looks really neat, and we just have that really nice effect, which of course will look fantastic when animated. And we do see a bit of grain within our render, but mainly that's caused by the fact that I'm only using the broadcast resolution and I don't have the advanced effects quality up, nor do I have the texture smoothing on. So there's a couple of things we can do to fix that and improve the overall quality. But what I want to do is just load in a couple of clouds really quick. So I'm going to go to our atmosphere editor, go to clouds, and add in a set of clouds. And I'm going to use the high cumulus, making sure that we're under spectral, and that way we can start to see those clouds under the water as well. And I'll go ahead and render that out. And we can see all those clouds now through our water, and it gives us a really neat looking effect. Now what we can also do is adjust the murkiness level once again. Go to our procedural terrain, under transparency, just increase the murkiness a little bit more. And now we'll start to see parts of the scene disappear, and along the top, we'll go ahead and render that. And the main thing we need to watch when using this effect is the way our fall off and the cutoff is for our murkiness level, because now we can see we have a very consistent color. It doesn't really get any darker, and we can see that overall outline from basically the view distance of the camera. So that's definitely one thing to keep in mind with your murkiness level, is also once we get closer to the surface, that effect and the way that gets cut off will be a little more obvious. But let's also take a look at the ground plane. And in order to really see the neat effects we're getting from this procedural terrain, what I want to do is just move this down closer to our ground plane. So we'll just use our size gizmo and bring it down on the Z. And I'm going to clear up the water a little bit so we can see the effect a little bit better. And I'm going to go back into the atmosphere editor and under light, increase the light balance more towards sunlight. And we'll be able to see the overall effect just a little bit better. So I'll go ahead and render that. And we can see all those really nice shadows on the ground from our water, which will give us sort of a faked caustics effect. Of course, right now it doesn't look very good with this blue color, and of course we're still using just that basic ground texture, so it's completely flat. We don't really have any sand on it. But you can also see in the distance a very thin line, and it's not extremely obvious. With a larger render it would be more obvious. But that's also something that will need to be removed, and we'll take a look at that once we start working on the scene a little bit more, and a couple of the different scenes depending on whether we're near the surface or just in deep water. And if we zoom out and take a look at this on the surface, and we can see it reflecting our sky, go ahead and do a quick render of that. And now it looks pretty good overall. Of course, our quality of our render, our atmosphere very grainy, causing a lot of grain within the reflection. And of course, because we are using procedural terrain and it has a limit, we're going to see that horizon line. As we increase our wave height, and of course our distance between the water and the main camera, we will start to see that disappear as we decrease that distance. But overall that looks pretty good. And now we're going to take a look at another option we can use for creating this type of effect, but of course it will have its drawbacks. So the first thing I want to do is just delete our procedural terrain. I'm going to go to the atmosphere editor, and I am going to go to the clouds and just delete those high cumulus we had added in. And now we want to take a look at using an infinite plane to create water. So go up to the upper left toolbar. We can select water to add in that infinite plane. And I also want to increase that distance from our ground plane, just so it gets a little bit deeper and we can see that murkiness level. And I'm also going to decrease the pitch on our sun, and that'll look a little better as well. Okay, so now we're just using the default water surface, and we'll go ahead and take a look at a render for that. And we can see overall it looks pretty good. Of course, we don't really have a lot of control over animation. Right now, really the only way to animate this specific water effect is if we go to select the water, open up the material editor, and we can animate the material surface z equals time. Now that's going to create a very basic animation, and we really don't have a whole lot of control over it. What we could also do is use, under the Effects tab, we have a velocity of material origin, which will move our surface throughout the material. The only problem is there really won't be any wave changes, and it'll just kind of move the surface. So it's not a very good effect for creating a realistic ocean or realistic waves. So what we can do is, if we go to our Bump tab, I'm going to right mouse click on this bump, and first I'm going to reset that function. So now we have no bump. If you take a look at the preview, and go ahead and make that just a little bit bigger, we can see it's just a completely flat reflective surface, not much to it. Go back into the material editor, I'm going to right mouse click on the bump production, go to edit function, and now with our bump selected, I'm going to go to the left and add in a fractal node. And now what we can do is change this to the open ocean, just as we did before, and I'm going to click OK, just with our default size. And because our depth is currently set to 0.2, I'm going to increase that to 5 so that we get enough depth from that surface in order to create good enough waves. So let's go ahead and render that out. So now we have an infinite plane, so we'll be able to extend all the way to the horizon with the exact same look as our procedural. Of course, we don't have the actual depth that we got from the procedural, and it might not give us the best quality, but overall it looks really good. And if you're not going to be too close to the water, then definitely this is the way you want to go for creating that sort of an effect. And we can of course adjust the overall bump amount and even the gain and the choppiness in order to raise up these waves. So if we go back into the water surface and our depth is currently 5, I'm going to increase that to 8. Click OK. And we can render that out. And now we can see a much more pronounced definition on each of our waves. And of course, this is also going to be animated the exact same way as the open ocean is on a procedural. So this will also create a really, really great looking animation for our ocean, and we can control those wave options, the choppiness and the gain. We also have the direction and the intensity of our wind settings. So there's a lot we can do just by using this as a bump map. And of course, there's also displacement mapping. The only problem is, because we're using an infinite plane, that displacement mapping, if it could render, would be a very, very, very long render time. Because basically it would be splitting up infinitely into an extremely large amount of geometry. So typically that's something you wouldn't do with the water unless you restricted the size of your object and not used infinite plane. Let's just move a little bit closer to the water and go ahead and render that. And now we can still see that this looks pretty good, but of course we don't have the quality and the definition, basically the height of our waves overlapping each other. So this really wouldn't work too close to the water to produce the best effect. So that's definitely something you would want to use a procedural terrain for. But of course, when we're close to that water, we don't need to worry about the horizon anyway. So it's not something that's too limited, unless you're going to be having a lot of movement in your animation and changes between the height. But even with a fast animation where you'd be kind of going into the water, this would work. The only problem is, let's go ahead and go into the water. If we take a look, we can see there's a huge difference between the procedural terrain and the infinite plane, and that is we can't see through the top of the infinite plane. We're not going to be able to see the sky or the sun, or even get a lot of the effects on the ground that we would normally get. If we move down a little bit closer, we can see it's just a very flat surface. And let's select our water and move it down closer to the ground plane. And if we take a look, we don't see any of the effects that we would get for an underwater shot. So this is definitely not something you'd want to be using to create an underwater environment. It's mainly what you want to use for an above water shot that has a pretty good distance above the water. We'll go ahead and raise that up a bit. And we can also take a look at this with some clouds. So I'm going to add a cloud layer. I'll just add that high cumulus again. We can go ahead and render that out. So this is definitely something that looks really good. Of course, we would need to increase the effects quality of our atmosphere. And in order to do that, I can just go ahead and close out this render and go to the atmosphere editor. And under light, we want to increase our quality boost to better, and that would give us a lot better look. And under the sky, fog, and haze global settings, we would increase our quality boost all the way, and that will give us the best looking effect for our overall sky and also the reflections that we see within the water. So this is another option that works for an above water shot. And let's take a look at what we can use to create our underwater scene, at least an underwater scene that's close to the surface. Because one where we have a deep water scene, that's entirely something we want to control with the atmosphere editor. So first I want to delete that water plane. And I'm also going to remove our cloud, so we can go back to the atmosphere editor, go to our cloud tab, and just hit delete for our high cumulus. And what we're going to use now is an object in order to create the effect that we want. Before we move on to a more volume object, let's first take a look at how a regular plane will look. And what we can do is go to our ruler tab, and I'm going to increase the size to 500. And of course our Z right now, because this is a plane, that option we don't want to modify. So I'm going to leave that the same. And now we can take this water effect, or this plane, to apply our water effect, load in our default water, and I'm just going to stick with that right now. We don't need to worry about using the open ocean. And if we take a look, it looks really good. Of course, it's not infinite. And if we take a look under the water, and actually where we were inside of the object before, we don't see that nice underwater look, or any of the murkiness, or that fade because of it. So we'll remove that. And the next thing we'll take a look at is using a cube. And I just want to scale that up. And we can squish down on the Z, move that down on the Z, or we can drop the object onto our ground plane. I'm going to go to the atmosphere editor on our light and readjust our light balance a little more towards ambient. And now in the ruler tab for our cube, I'm going to increase the X and the Y to 500. And then we're also going to load in that default water surface. And now the problem we're going to run into is basically the same one we had before, which is, because this is a cube shape, the extent, you'll really be able to see the edges and the corners, and it's not going to work too much. Right now we're not seeing that too much in the preview because of our murkiness level. So we'll go to transparency, clear that up just a little bit, and go ahead and do a quick render. And we can really see the extent of it. There's a lot of errors and problems, so we need to look at using a different shape. And what we're going to be using is a cylinder, because of course a cylinder won't have any corners and won't give us those same problems. Of course, this is going to be something that's only for underwater shots, and really only something you want to use for being close to the surface. So we'll start out by loading in our cylinder, go to our ruler tab, and this time I'm going to increase our X and Y to 2000 and our Z to 30, go to our cylinder, load in the default water material, and I'll go into the bump, reset the function, go into the function editor, making sure we right mouse click, go to edit function, and double clicking will open our load window to load in saved functions. Go to our bump, we can select a fractal, change that to our open ocean, set our depth to 8, and now we have that open ocean fractal loaded. And we're going to move down into the water. And we can start to see some of our other problems that are going to arise. But we do have solutions for that, and there are ways to fix it. And we'll just raise this up a little bit, and first just take a look directly down at the object. And the water looks really good from above. Of course, we have that horizon showing up. Go ahead and close that out. And I'm going to increase the depth of this overall volume. So we're going to go back to the ruler tab, and I'm going to change the Z to 70 meters. And that way we've got a little bit of deeper water we can work with. And we're going to go inside the water. And as we look up, we can see the same sort of an effect we had before, where we can see the sky, and it looks really good. I am going to decrease the size of that bump material, and change our bump scale down to 0.5. Click OK. And now we can have more waves, and simulate a larger area. If we move down into our water, down below, towards the ground plane, we don't see a lot of shadow, mainly because at this point, lower in the water, everything's going to be diffused and dispersed, and we wouldn't really see that anyway. And I'm going to move fairly close to our ground plane, and select our ground plane, and I'm just going to add a surface to this, and go to landscapes, and actually it looks like might want to go to rocks. So we'll select rocks and select our sand. We could use wet sand. There's a lot of different options available for this. We're just going to use the regular sand, and what I want to do is change our color for this. So I'm going to edit our color map, because ocean sand is going to be a little bit more white towards the surface and by reefs, mostly because of the parrotfish that will eat our hard corals and then excrete their waste as the white sand, and that will build up, building islands, and that looks a little more like that type of effect. Of course, we'd want to be using a terrain and not something completely flat. But now we can see that sand. We can go ahead and render that. And this is a sand that you'd really want to use more towards a shoreline because of the depth. So what we can do is select our ground plane, go to our bump for this material, and I'm going to reduce this down to 0.1, just because we don't want all of that definition in there. And really, still that's something that's not going to be very realistic for sort of an out in the ocean effect. But we can still see the nice shadows in some of the areas caused by that water. So now we're going to bring down that cylinder. If we take a look just in one of the side views, we can move down the cylinder, and we just want to get this closer to that ground plane so that we can see the nice caustic effect that's being caused. And as we bring that down even closer, that effect becomes greater. We'll go ahead and render that out. And now we can see all the caustics caused by that water. And of course, since we're using the open ocean once again, we can animate that, and we'll be able to see that nice movement on our surface. And there's a couple of things to keep in mind when using caustics with this effect. And mainly, if we take a look, we want to make sure that we're not using compute physically accurate caustics within our render options, because that is not really going to work for this type of an effect because we are inside of a volume. If I turn that on right now, everything disappears. And even if I go to our cylinder and we take a look under Transparency, Enable Dispersion, we're not going to see any sort of caustic effects. And what that will also do, since we're in a volume, is remove all shadows from objects. So let's go ahead and add an object into the scene just so you can see that a little bit better. Go ahead and position. And I'm going to add in just a sphere. And I want to change that to our size gizmo. Make that larger. Just something that is going to cast a shadow. And it looks like the sphere is a little bit too big, so we'll go ahead and scale that down. And if we take a look at the render, we can see that there are absolutely no shadows on this object, on the ground plane, or really anywhere. And that's one of the problems being inside the volume. If I go up to our render options, turn off Compute Physically Accurate Caustics, which will also remove the ability to have dispersion turned on, which gives us our rainbow type effects in transparent objects. Now we can see the shadow has come back, and we can also see those caustics from our water. Now we're going to take a look at another problem. Delete that sphere, and I'm going to just move up our cylinder once again. We're going to take a look into the distance under our water. And what we can see is a very light area, basically where our cylinder is ending. And because we cannot infinitely scale this cylinder and make it an extremely large size, we're always going to end up with a line. And if we make this 30 or 50,000 meters by 50,000 meters and just a huge size, we're still going to end up with a very thin line that's going to show up and really make this effect not so realistic, because of course that would be deeper and it's going to be a lot darker of water. If we go to our atmosphere editor, sky, fog, and haze, we turn down our haze and click OK and take a look at our render. You can see that it has not changed anything. Now technically what you can do is change the color of your haze and your fog and kind of bring those in. The only problem is matching those colors up to make them look correct really isn't going to work, and there are much better ways to deal with this issue. What we can also do is if we turn on volumetric sunlight, it looks like it has gone away, but once we render it, there is a distinct color change as a strip through the center of our render. And now whether or not you can see that, it is very subtle. I'm not quite sure because of the compression of the video, but it is definitely there, and what we can see is just a little bit darker of an area, pretty much right where our cylinder is ending. And we would always end up seeing that line, and of course volumetric sunlight is going to take longer to render. So it's really not a solution to our problem. I'm going to go back into the atmosphere editor, turn off that volumetric sunlight, and we can see that again. And now if we switch this to a different model, because right now we're using the spectral model, we can switch this to the volumetric model, and now what we see is an even more drastic effect of that. And what we can do is turn off the haze and the fog, but now we've lost all of our light in the scene, because with a volumetric model, our haze and fog really control the overall brightness of our sky. And even if we go to the light tab and make it a little brighter, increase our lighting gain on the sky dome, we're not seeing any more light on that ground plane. So it's really not a solution for that. Go to the standard model, we're going to end up seeing the same sort of an effect. That line at the end is pretty much always going to show up. We could turn off our fog and haze. We'll go ahead and render that. And now, mostly this is blending together pretty well. The only problem is the standard lighting model doesn't disperse our light as well as some of the other models. And basically what we're going to be doing is using HDRI lighting to take care of some of these effects. And that's because then we're going to be using an image in the background that will pretty much remove all of our different errors. But the main problem with this is, although it looks good for more of a deep water shot, if we take a look at our sky, and I'm just going to move our camera up a little bit closer to the surface, it's a very basic color, just kind of flat across. We don't really see any specular effects, and it's just really not something that's going to work. And it may look like it solves the problem, but if you want to move the camera around a lot and get the most realistic looking effect, this is definitely not something you want to be using. So we're going to start building a scene, and then we can take a look at correcting some of these different errors, and also start adding in volumetric lighting and getting some light beams casting through our water to create some really neat looking effects, and also ways to keep down the grain, because normally with a lot of different volumetric light settings and ways that you would create those light beams, you end up with a very large amount of grain in the scene, even with some of the higher quality settings. So there are ways to reduce that, and we'll be taking a look at that as we start building the scene.